Welcome to today's Politics and Tactics. We got a great show for you today. I'm going to allow PJ to introduce our guests, but we're going to be talking about a new book, Running Out of Time. This book is about wildfires and the imperiled forest. The fact is, this is the best firefighting book I've ever read by non-firefighters. And we were honored to have both authors here. And the book was it was honestly mind-blowing from being a firefighter from the Northeast to learn not only about wildland fires, but also all the things we didn't know and all the problems when it comes to managing wildfires and how the government sometimes gets in the way of that. It's just really, really interesting read. PJ, can you introduce our guests?
Yeah, Frank, thanks. I'm going to change things up a little bit today. Nobody ever really wants to hear from Frank and I, and introducing individuals, especially some that aren't directly from the fire service and have a different skill set and different experience than we're used to. It's going to go around the room and have each one of them give a brief introduction of themselves on specifically on what's important regarding today's conversation. So, in no specific order, Brian, welcome to the show, Chief. And if you can give us a little bit of your background.
Thank you both for the invitation. My name is Brian Fennessy, and I'm the fire chief here with the Orange County Fire Authority in Southern California. And I got my fire service start back in 1978. This is my 45th year in the fire service. First 13 years of my career I spent with the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, where I started on hotshot crews and left as a hotshot crew superintendent to go to work for the city of San Diego, where I spent nearly 30 years, the last 3 years as the city's fire chief, and was recruited heavily to come up here to Orange County, and have been here, nearly 6 years. So within that 45 years, a ton of wild land fire experience. I've managed large air operations and spent times on incident management teams and experienced the big fires in Southern California in 1980 and Yellowstone in 88 and the recent fires. We're just celebrating, in fact, 20 years from the Cedar Fire here in California that was the largest fire in California for many years. So I'm excited to talk more about it. I love the book. It's great to be able to be talking with others that have like minds and perspectives here. It's been a frustrating time for me over the last several years. So thank you for the intro.
Well, thank you, Chief. And it's not too often we get somebody, a fire chief who has a model helicopter in their office. I think that's pretty cool and not something here in New England that, we're used to. So I'm looking to learn from you as well as the other guests today. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
David?
Well, thank you. And gosh, Chief, thank you for joining us and thanks for having us today. My background, I'm a corporate turnaround executive, worked through my own firm, a boutique turnaround firm, worked with 200 or so different clients over 30 years. And basically through my turnaround experience, and now my wife says I failed retirement, on a couple of boards and wrote this book with Jeff about wildfires and managing our forests, and really got into the topic because of our interest in, first, the frustration we had personally in trying to acquire an aerial firefighting company back in 2011, 2012. But the book's not a vitriolic condemnation of that experience. It was an opportunity really to lay out kind of an unbiased, kind of holistic view of the situation at hand and what we thought would be logical ways to approach solving the problem. So that's a little bit of background on myself.
Great, thank you. And last, definitely not least, Jeff?
So my background, my earliest management experience includes an assignment that as a senior marketing and sales executive for Europe, Africa, the Middle East, India, the UK, and Channel Islands, and for a major logistics firm I lived in Rotterdam, Holland, for the Netherlands, I shouldn't say Holland. For the first 20 years or so of my career, I worked in large companies. I was a vice president of Lockheed and later served as a vice president for private industry affairs for the for an airport trade association globally in DC. I left there to become the senior vice president general manager of an airline, which was an experience that I don't care to repeat anytime soon. It's sleep interruptive, and also, as they say in the airline business, if you want to make $1 million, start with $1 billion. I've been historically involved in the development of aviation and aerospace market-related topics such as logistics, training, strategic planning, organization, as well as corporate and military scenario planning. I guess you could say black swan planning, to be exact. And among others, and actually was where David and I met, was at a preeminent aerial firefighting company that no longer exists, that I worked with the president, and it was a very unfortunate thing. But Dave and I spent 20 months together looking at this business, and as he said, you see it from a very different perspective when you're not in it, when you're not immersed in it immediately. And from a corporate perspective, it's easier to see from outside than it is from inside. One thing I can tell you as a takeaway is that there are a lot of frustrated people in the U.S. Forest Service. So with that, I'll just be quiet and participate as required. So.
Well, we don't want you to be quiet. I mean, this is about your book, your work, which I think is unbelievable. And I want to start off the conversation, and we'll kind of go around the horn on this. I'll start with David, but something struck me in the forward, and I think it'll kind of spark your imagination here. Regardless of the misguided good intentions behind these efforts, they are literally loving the forests they wish to protect to death. Can you explain what's going on with our forests, kind of as a way to set up this conversation for what needs to be done?
Policy, simply policy. The policy has been established by the Forest Service and by the government generally, has been one of really influenced, in my view, and Jeff's, by environmental concerns. Obviously, that's not a bad thing per se, but over the last 40 or 50 years, what's occurred is we've had a number of deferred maintenance, we'll call it, issues that are going on inside the forests themselves. Lack of forest thinning, lack of not clear cutting, but lack of taking out bark beetle and infested trees, focused management of the forests has not occurred. And then at the same time, there's been a significant decrease in the investment in fire suppression by the federal government levels. And between the two, we have a crisis that's developed. And instead of dealing with the crisis, we have more studies and we've had more commissions and more studies than you want to shake a stick at. Nonetheless, the loving the forest to death, lots of tree huggers out there. I'm not against tree huggers. I just think we need to have a balanced, holistic approach to managing our forests, and we do not have that today.
No, I think a lot of our viewers didn't expect you to come up with that answer, because I expected you to say, climate change, climate change, climate change. But yes, I think our climate has always been changing since the beginning of time. But the fact of the matter is, we can do a better job loving our forests with proper policies where we can be good stewards. I'm going to go to Jeff. Jeff, the American Indians I was, pleased to read in your book that they did a good job being good stewards of the forest. Can you speak to that and about the state of the forest?
Well, the Indians have been dealing with this for millennia. The interesting thing about this is that the Indians and the U.S. Forest Service have a rather unusual relationship. It's called none, basically, because the Forest Service doesn't listen to them. And some of the issues that they've had, one in particular was absolutely stunning to me as it relates to carbon. And David can correct me if I'm wrong, is the Turok Indians, which are out on the coast of California and I believe lower southern Oregon. After the BP incident in the Gulf, BP went to the Turoks and said, we want to buy carbon credits from you. And so the Indian tribe said, that's fine. We'll sell you. I don't remember what the number of acres was, but it was substantial. It was a multi-million-dollar deal. And this is how you learn the hard way if you're not careful. It was a fire, forest fire, and it burned the whole forest that they had contracted to for the carbon emission. And BP turned around, knocked on the door, and said, "Please, we want repayment for for the fire that just took our carbon credits." Now that doesn't answer the question, but the control burns, the things that the tribes have done over the years, should be very instructive, and we need to pay more attention to them. I know that the tribe groups just had their annual meeting, and they're prepared to help, but they have to be asked. I don't know whether
So that's interesting. So we're not reaching out to all the stakeholders. Now, Chief, you have the experience of actually fighting fires and managing these fires. I've noticed there's a couple incident command charts that firefighters are very familiar with. And when it comes to ICS in the Northeast, we usually do groups, divisions, maybe a branch. If there's a sector, that's a big thing. But we all are trained in ICS, and when we look at ICS charts, they're very easy to understand. But when I looked in this book on the ICS charts when it comes to dealing with a forest fire, my mind started to hurt. So if you could kind of talk to us a little bit about, can we do a better job of managing the fire, the forest, and also about how many different agencies are involved. And there seems to be a lot of duplication of effort, and there seems to be some lack of effort and kind of people's missions being in different directions. Can you kind of weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's a lot, so I'll try to keep it as concise as I can. But I want to say that I completely agree with David and Jeff's positions on this. We're dealing with an unhealthy forest. We have been for a long time, and lots of reasons for that. There's the 10 a.m. rule that goes way back to the early 1900s, that all fires would be suppressed by 10 a.m. the next day. And quite frankly, the fire service did a pretty good job of that. We've done that to a good degree, and it's created. Well, it's one reason that we've created an unhealthy forest. We haven't managed, prescribed fire well. And, we're at a point now, I'm drifting a little bit off subject, that it's, because of the large fires we're having here in the West, the tolerance for more fire on the landscape and worse, smoke in the communities has grown less. So the more we need to be more proactive, the harder it is to get public acceptance for it. And I agree with you wholeheartedly with what David said about the environmentalists. I mean, one just needs to look, and it was an issue when I was leaving the federal wildland agencies, the spotted owl. I mean, logging has all but ceased. And you know what? The loggers did a pretty darn good job of managing the forest, a really good job. The ranchers, certainly the tribes. And so we've lost a lot of that. The ICS system works, and yes, you're right. On some of these large fires, they become very large organizations. But what we're seeing now, because of the number of large fires that are taking place, we don't have the incident management personnel that we used to. There's an estimated 30,000 firefighters available, and that's federal, state, and local, in the Western U.S. And we're seeing that now year after year, that we just run out of firefighters. The fires have become so large that really we know sometimes early on that the only way these fires are going to go out is when Mother Nature decides it's time for them to go out. And well, some of them are creating huge, damage, irreparable damage in terms of vegetation type conversion and some of those other things. There are areas where these large fires are burning in low intensity that are accomplishing what we would if we managed fire well on the landscape. So there's a lot of discussion. I know the Science and Technology from DHS has got a group together, and they're launching low orbit, satellites and those sorts of things to really start looking at these large fires and determining, where we focus our efforts instead of trying to, suppress the entire fire. Is really focus on those areas that are doing the damage and those areas of the fires that are burning and actually doing some health and giving some health. Maybe not focusing on them, but right now it's like moths to the light. There's fire in the air, man. We're trying to do everything we can to suppress them, and quite frankly, many of these they're beyond our being able to suppress them. It's discouraging, and I agree with Jeff said. Biden's Wildfire Commission just released their report. It's 300 and some pages. I have close friends that were on the commission, and even today, there's concern that as much as they said this wouldn't end up on the shelf, we're pretty sure it's going to end up on the shelf if we don't get some sort of congressional oversight or somebody that's really going to squeeze on the issues. I've heard the word frustrated a number of times so far on this podcast, and I share that frustration, and we'll share more when there's time, just from my own personal experience.
Let me add something to what the chief said. It's been, I believe it's 12 commissions in 10 years or 10 commissions in 12 years. I had a friend of mine that served on a commission, a blue ribbon commission in 2002, made 8 recommendations to the Forest Service as it related to aerial firefighting, was the bureau chief for Aviation Week and Space Technology, and went back and looked at the recommendations and what happened. To the chief's point, it's on a shelf. Nothing ever happened as a result of it. And so that is...
Well, those of us who work in public policy, we know that as soon as they say they want to establish a commission, a task force, or a study, that's a place where good public policy, common sense public policy, goes to die. Unfortunately, we all think, oh, we're getting a study. This is going to be great. We're going to be looking at the science. And all too often, it collects on the shelf, which is just tragic. Now, I always like to talk about the pendulum of injustice, because usually things are really bad, and instead of putting it in the middle where it probably should be, they go really bad on the opposite side. And does logging, like when I was a kid, logging was really bad because of the endangered species. But then I remember probably about 12 or 13 years old, there started that big campaign about responsible logging, that you can log and then plant a tree. And there was all that effort. Is there still a role for responsible logging to help with fire lines and things of that nature, and still be responsible and still be a good steward of the forest? Or is logging bad? I'll start with Jeff and we'll go around the horn.
It's easy. I'll reinforce what David and the chief said. And I've talked to the logging associations. Matter of fact, they just had their annual conference. And the Forest Service doesn't even talk to them. And these guys could really be very, very helpful to the Forest Service. And they're paying economically for not being able to do the logging that they should. I mean, they've shut down mills. It's crazy. But the loggers have the technology. They have the management experience. The Cal Forest people are represented by some really pretty smart guys that own a lot of land. And they're just, nobody consults with them. It's like the Indian situation. And these are people that have that wealth of information. And so anyway, that just to reinforce both David and the chief's comments. So,
PJ?
Let me add to that. Well, since 1970, 1975, 343 sawmills have been shut down inside the forests. Loggers have been basically treated as enemies of the Forest Service. The Forest Service doesn't talk to the logging community. Even during a fire, the best equipment to help take charge of the fire are in the hands of loggers, and those people are not contracted in the case of a fire for heavy equipment needs. And so the communities are just not talking to each other. Our view is that loggers represent a huge opportunity to help be a steward, because they, with the ranchers and with others in the community and the Indians are good examples of logging. They actually have, fire masters and logging masters inside their tribes to understand the nature of the tree, the age of the tree, the density of the forest, and clear the forest based upon centuries-old traditions. So we have a lot to learn and a lot from these constituents, but the conversations seem to be, there are no conversations, and policies are going nowhere. I have to bring this up because it's timely, but Senators Manchin and Brasso introduced legislation in September 20th, that basically picked up many of the points we raised in our book. I don't know if we sent our book to Congress, to each of the two significant committees in the House and the Senate. And one of the things we call for in the book is for much more active forest clearing and forest management, logging and thinning. And the legislation actually calls for doubling and doubling again over the next 4 years, logging and thinning. In response to that, there was a hearing. And the hearing was held on literally last week. And Jacqueline Emanuel from the Forest Service gets up in the hearing and states that the proposals put on the table would be too cumbersome for the Forest Service to take on. I mean, we are all trying to help solve the problem, and the Forest Service seems to take every suggestion as a personal affront. Rather than being constructive, 40,000 employees working at the Forest Service, paid for by us, what are we getting for that? It's frankly discouraging and angering, and to have this woman, Jacqueline, stand up and take this position is, I can't say what I think about it. It's insane. So I want to express my personal view about it because it's timely and frustrating. So we'll use that word.
There you go. It's the perfect word. To further what Jeff and David shared, that there are examples within the country where logging is being very successful. A few years ago, I visited the state of Georgia forestry, and they produce out of the southeast and the state more lumber it's incredible. I mean, they're reproducing it. It is like any other crop, if you will, but they're doing it very, very successfully. And again, I'm no expert in that field, but I got to think there's some takeaways that could be used here. And it's funny you say that about Jacqueline too, David. We're seeing more money in the West being appropriated to manage the landscape, fuel reductions, fuel management, whatever you want to call it. What we're seeing is less people available to do it. It's no secret that, the federal, firefighting force is undercompensated and not benefited well, and they have been leaving in droves. And should, Congress not get their act together and they not keep, the little bit that they've been given, you're going to see that happening more and more. We're experiencing that here locally and throughout the state of California. I don't think the Forest Service, I think the best they got this year was about 40% firefighter, funded. I mean, they've got the funding, they just don't have the firefighters to do it. And it reminded me, David, what you said about Vicki Christensen was the Forest Service chief before the current chief. And I'll never forget, it was 2 or 3 years ago before the current chief, and when Congress asked, do you have enough, want to know if you have enough wildland firefighting, air fixed wing and helicopters, tossed her a softball. And she says, we're fine. We don't need anything else. And those of us that live in this just about fell over. Now, whether or not she was told she had to say that or whether she really truly believed it, either one's a problem. But we're experiencing, problems here locally, even in my county, with the Forest Service being able to staff fire station to the point where this Friday, me and the Riverside County Chief are meeting with the forest supervisor. He didn't know what we're meeting with him about, but to talk about these unstaffed fire stations, because fires up on the national forest, when the wind blows here, tend to blow into our communities and kill people and burn a lot of structures. And if they're not going to staff them, pay us, and I'll put fire engines up on the hill in Forest Service stations. But we're seeing it, throughout the aviation world. And I hope at some point, what I really loved about the book was the conversation about some of the aviation resources and the contracting issues in Boise, the fixed wing issues. And I don't know if any of you saw the 60 Minutes piece we did a couple of years ago that was supposed to be a feel-good piece that turned into kind of a hit piece on the Forest Service. And that wasn't intended. The producers of 60 Minutes will tell you this was always supposed to be a feel-good story, but the behavior that they witnessed firsthand at the Caldor fire, turned their story into something. And I can kind of share with you the outcome of that over the last 2 years and how that's, when we get to that point about what we're doing about it now and how that's affected the West out here. But anyways, I won't say frustrating again, but it's frustrating.
So I'm going to just jump in here. So where does the problem really exist? All right. So you're just doing a little research now. I'll have to admit, I haven't read the book, so you may cover this in the book. But if you do, it's good for the listeners. Back in July, there was an announcement made that $185 million was being allocated for wildfire mitigation resilience. $12.5 million of that was towards 63 projects, states like California, Colorado, Montana, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. To directly impact 40,000 acres to improve landscape resilience. 11.4 million of that was for a special pay supplement for federal wildland firefighters. So, the literature will say that there's money being allocated. Is that money actually reaching where it needs to reach? And if so, what is the actual problem if there's money being allocated and services aren't being changed or impacted to help this problem?
Okay, let me take a cut at that. Okay, so the $185 million is part of the overall $2 billion that was allocated in the infrastructure bill in 2021 for wildland fire management improvement. And it took the Forest Service almost 2 years to develop plans to actually allocate that money, despite the fact the Forest Service knows that there is 100 million acres, or the size of California, of forest at risk, affecting 70 million Americans and 46,000 communities. This is a known fact. Something has been known since 2019 when the government accounting office identified this as being an issue within the Forest Service. It took the infrastructure bill to get funding associated with that to start to fund the problem. But 100 million acres is a lot of acreage. The average cost per acre to fix and thin an acreage is somewhere between $125 and $500 per acre. You can do the math. That's $50 billion on the top end. So 185 million is a drop in the bucket in terms of what the size of the problem is. The press and the Forest Service love to announce these projects and money spent, but it's a dent in the size of the problem. And we're not addressing, as a policy matter, the seriousness of this. That's why it's a crisis.
I'm definitely going to get into the aircraft thing, but I want to start because I thought that this was the height of absurdity about how we utilize some of the heavy equipment resources.
Ugh.
And that it blew my mind. And correct me if I'm wrong. I'll go to Jeff first. But in the book, it talks about heavy equipment before they get to the fire line. When an incident commander calls them, they have to be inspected, which just makes no sense to me. It would make more sense if you inspected anything that you're going to call to the scene once a year or once every 5 years and ensure that you have a hydraulic and a heavy equipment mechanic dispatched to every fire. My son works construction. They take good care of their machines and they always have a mechanic on standby. So to have a bulldozer go 50 miles or 100 miles to get inspected to get on a fire line and to only have them work during the day is just mind-blowing. So we can go around the horn about this, but for like a firefighter, I'm thinking, hey, I'm a chief in New Haven, retired, but if I needed a bulldozer, I'd call a bulldozer and I would get one there. And if I was real sharp, I'd say, get me a mechanic here as well. But I would get a bulldozer. There's no bureaucracy with it. So to find out that there's bureaucracy when an incident commander wants heavy equipment and then they only work during the day, maybe I got that part wrong, it's just the height of absurdity. So we'll go with Jeff and we'll kind of go around.
Absurd isn't, I mean, there is a book that was written years ago that contained not just our book. This was actually a resource book that was written by two guys, and that basically was a Bible to tell incident commanders and everybody in the Forest Service what kind of equipment was available, who it was available from, what their telephone number was, what their email address was, and how to use the equipment. And nobody paid attention to it at all. And when you look at the contracting issues, I understand why you want to make sure that a piece of equipment is in good shape. But if you've done it once, leave the guy alone. Don't make him drag a bulldozer or some other heavy piece of equipment 100 miles back to have somebody look at it to say that it's okay, and then send it to somewhere where nobody knows how to use it. It's crazy. I mean, it's not crazy. It's just unfortunate. The heavy equipment.
Wait, Chief, let's go with the chief. You might get a bulldozer on the line without an operator that comes with that actual piece of equipment?
No, that shouldn't happen. But, down in Southern California is kind of a different anomaly, right? I mean, the local government agencies, the big agencies, we all operate helicopters and bulldozers and hand crews, but that's not typical, certainly throughout the West or the U.S. When they start going, as Jeff said, and start ordering emergency contract equipment and contractors they already know, in advance are available, but then send them to the incident to be re-inspected again when you need to put them on the line. They do that with aircraft, the call when needed or basically emergency contract aircraft. You need aircraft. They show up. Now, you've got somebody that's not a trained aviator or somebody in that, a Forest Service or even local government manager that has some level of training that go through a checklist. And it's a pretty extensive checklist. Meanwhile, the hill's burning and you really need to put the thing to work. So there are, a lot of unnecessary processes that take place. I look at the night piece. We've been flying helicopters at night and dropping water for 20 years. The Forest Service has one helicopter that does that now, and that's because they were forced to after 2003.
Okay, wait a second. So the Forest Service essentially, because we're talking about the whole country here, and if they only have one helicopter, and we're talking about billions of millions of acres, they don't fly at night?
One helicopter fly at night that's out of Fox in LA County. We've got multiple, including the big helicopter model you see behind me. We've got one of these that drops 3,000 gallons, staffed 24/7, year-round. One of them here in Orange County, one in LA County, and one in Ventura County, not to mention our own agency-owned aircraft that also, fly at night. And we've been doing this for 20 years.
So you guys are the example of a public policy that it has common sense, because the fires don't just burn during the day. They keep burning and exponentially growing at night. So your department and your area should be used as best practice, as the rest of the country should duplicate this. Wildfires used to only be an interesting thing that we used to see on the news in the Northeast, but now we can't even see on some summer days because the smoke is getting here. So every senator and every representative now actually is part of the wildland fires just for the last, I'd say, 2 years. One thing, and then Jeff, I'll go to you, and I want to make sure I get PJ and Dave in here too. Yeah. But when there's a fire, everybody who's listening to this, all our viewers now are saying, wait a second, when there's a fire, we don't flip the cab on the fire truck and do a pre-trip before we go respond to the fire. I mean, that's the one thing about the fire service. You're ready. So why wouldn't there just be a daily pre-trip on the aircraft so that when there's a call, they're ready to immediately respond? I mean, this is bureaucracy gone amok. I mean, if there was ever a study in bureaucracy just making things worse, this seems to be it.
It's a small piece of that because, having worked for the Forest Service and then the Department of Interior Bureau of Land Management, raised up through not only the crew but the aviation piece, is you are trained or programmed to believe that every vendor is out to scam you out of some money. I mean, that is the culture. The approach is they're up to no good, that, hey, you got to watch them carefully because they're just trying to get some. I mean, and that is ingrained in you in that world. And it's not so. Are there a couple bad actors out there? Sure. But everybody knows who they are. And you know what? The vendors know who they are. And so there's a lot of self-policing that takes place. When for that 60 Minutes piece, we flew out of Southern California to Northern California with the 3 Chinooks in our command and control platform because they were losing complete towns. And down here, the weather was such that we felt like that was a good risk. So the Ventura and LA County chief and I agreed to send them up there. And come to find out later that the Forest Service in Washington was furious about it. And it's like, well, why? Well, for the last 20 years, and they heard it in Northern California, they were told that, hey, night flying, firefighting helicopters is a Southern California thing only, doesn't fit in Northern California, doesn't have a place in the West. And that is nonsense. I will tell you, there are a lot less wires in Northern California. There's a lot less. You can absolutely. So we made the first water drops, aerial water drops, and retardant, because we drag a retardant plant with us. So we can drop that pink retardant day or night. In fact, we put more retardant on a fire at night with one of these than the fixed wing can all day. That got back to Washington, and they're furious. And that 60 Minutes piece really freaking rocked their world. Now they've got some contracts, what I'm told, some solicitations out, they being the Forest Service, looking for Type 1 operators, Type 1 helicopter operators, these large helicopters to fly at night. The challenge is for them, and I'm close with a number of them, is, hey, look, we'd love to do that, but the Forest Service is only giving us these 1-year contracts. And for us to buy the equipment, to hire the crew, because to crew them 24 hours, you're going to have to hire more people and pay them. The banks aren't going to loan them money when you've only got a 1-year contract. They would love to get into the night space. This is not new technology. This is not even really innovation. This is existing capability that should be used throughout the West. It's just, it blows my mind that so many people with those agencies take a position of who these people think they are, why are they doing this, instead of really grabbing a hold of it. And that's really kind of what we're pushing right now is night aerial retardant suppression. And we are beating the drum that this is what we need to be doing throughout the West. The airplanes, when they go home during the day because they can't fly and drop the retardant at night, there's no reason we cannot keep dropping retardant at night.
There was something that you brought up, Chief, that I also found very, very telling in this book, was that the contracts are only a year. So Jeff kind of mentioned it earlier. If you want to open an airline, you need $1 billion to make $1 million. I think he said. But so if you only have a year government contracts and you want to start to innovate and to get a company going that flies to suppress fires, that gets contracted, it's Dave, speak to that. How could it?
They will tell you that these are 10-year contracts now, right? But they're not. They're 10-year contracts, but they're 1-year
exactly
option year.
right.
There's no freaking guarantee that you're going to be able to do this. And then the Forest Service, in their wisdom, will have the vendors add pieces of equipment, special equipment to their aircraft without any interaction with the vendors. The vendors know, and when I say vendors, I really mean the operators. Man, you let these operators, in my world, you'd have the operators come in. If I were the Forester, we'd sit down and we would together would craft, man, it's a solid wall. Those operators know better than the Forest Service, than government,
Absolutely.
what to do, what they can't do for you. And it's a shame.
Absolutely. Without a doubt. I worked on the only multi-year funding program that existed in the 90s and the early 2000s. That was a C-17 program, and that'll never happen again. And we, David and I, when we originally started this, said there isn't enough money around to even fund a fleet, which is a private operator isn't going to go out and buy 200 airplanes. You can't afford it.
Right.
It's a serious.
Remember, Jeff? Remember there were 60 some air tankers available at one time. You know how many we have now?
15.
18.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not to include the call 15. When needed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not including calling. So nationwide, we have 15 aircraft. To the Chief's point, the Forest Service will tell you they've just recently changed practice to allow 10-year contracts. They are not 10-year contracts. They're 1-year contracts with options to renew at the end of each year. To the point the Chief makes, a financial institution looking at those operators and saying, show me your contract, that's a 1-year contract, period. They're not going to loan the company enough money to allow innovation or hiring the right term people. It's unsustainable. It's a terrible practice. And to the Chief's earlier point, the specifications required from the Forest Service to the operators is non-existent. We don't see any specifications that are calling for the operators, okay, we want you to be able to drop with 85% accuracy on this fire at this particular number of units and loads, and have that kind of a specification. That is not mentioned in any of the documents we've read, any contract we've seen. And it's rather than that, they talk about the contract itself is a 2-inch document that there's a bunch of gobbledygook. We think that, the opportunity here is to start changing policy. And we should talk about what we think the policy should be going forward. But that's the first step. When you start changing policy, everything else starts to fall in line.
Let me go back and reinforce something that the Chief said. this country has the capability and has had the capability to fly at night, to fly 24 hours a day, going back until at least the early 90s with night vision goggles. And they've done it, and they've done it successfully. The issue is you have to find qualified pilots, which is not the easiest thing in the world to do today anyway, let alone rotorcraft pilots. But there is a supply of those guys in and women in service that are trained by the Army at Rucker and who have great experience and are looking for a path to when they get out of the service to serve their communities. But the Forest Service won't let you fly at night. It's ridiculous. And the CPS thing was really good. We saw it. Dave and I have talked about that a bunch of times. It's a problem. If you don't recognize what the technology that you have at your fingertips.
Both segments.
I mean, the complexities of the aerial workspace, if you will, is beyond your wildest dreams. All you have to do is talk to a guy in the right-hand seat in a lead plane who's directing traffic to understand what goes on and how difficult that is and what the systems are that could be used. I'll go out and say you probably could use an AWACS aircraft to direct the traffic.
Chief, for those of us that here in the East Coast that may not be familiar with the operations, let's kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about operationally. We're talking about the fire service and we're talking about the fire service itself and the Forest Service and the fire service. How do these incidents transpire as far as the fire service goes in and handle these until you need additional resources, or is it combined effort right from the beginning?
Anymore, at least in California, and I work with the Western Fire Chiefs Association as well, so I'm very familiar with the other states. But more so down here in the urban areas, it really is an all hands effort. So right now, as I sit here, we're in the second day of a Santa Ana wind event. We've got single digit humidities outside, the temperature's warm, and the wind is blowing. There's wind advisories throughout Orange, LA, and Ventura County. So the opportunity to have a very large fire today is real. So should we get a fire on a normal day or a day like today, we're going to push out a very robust response of engines, of hand crews, bulldozers, aircraft, both fixed and rotor wing, to really try to keep the fire small, because that's always been the key, right? It's just that simple. If you can keep them small, you don't have the large fire. Once they get beyond, what we can throw at the fight, it's off to the races, and we're kind of beholden to, the fuel, weather, and topography. So it really is, whether it's a fed state, and we have a contiguous border with the Cleveland National Forest. We protect in Orange County, in LA, and Ventura State, what we call state responsibility areas, basically CAL FIRE's acres that we're responsible for, and we get paid to do that. But one of the challenges we have, and we experienced that in 2018 and since then, and we had a big fire, same time the Camp Fire was burning in Butte County that killed, 80 people. We had the Woolsey Fire in Malibu, another fire that started inland and burned all the way to the ocean. And I remember getting a call, started that afternoon. I got a call from the LA County chief. This is in 2018. And he asks, hey, man, do you have any more resources you can send? And I'd already sent 6 strike teams, which is 30 engines. Strike team is 5 engines with a leader. And there were resources up north being drawn away because they had the campfire going. And I have nearly 80 stations and multiple units in a lot of the stations. So I probably got, on any given day, 100 fire engines available. And LA County is obviously larger than us. LA City, I think we're number 3 behind LA County and then LA City. Where I'm going with this is the system that we use to order resources, it starts locally. It goes to a region. A region might have 6 counties that make requests to it. If you can't fill those resource requests within the region, then it goes to a geographical area coordination center that has a larger draw. Then it can go to another GAC or even nationally, to get more resources. But that takes time, right? And well, I would argue that Southern California is probably the most resourced geographic area maybe in the world. When fires are wind driven like they are down here, when you need 100 engines, you need 100 engines like within the next hour or two, not in the next day or two. Well, the system that's being used tries not to impact, the local area completely. So they're hitting, they're making these requests for resources in outlying areas. And by the time the system works its way through, and it's not a fast system, it's called IROC, is how it goes into. It's a great system for tracking your resources and getting them paid. Nothing was due with speed. And it's a Forest Service program. It's a federal program. We lost hundreds of homes. People were killed. The after action of the Woolsey fire said, look, there's got to be a better way. So I got together with the LA City, LA County, and Ventura County chiefs, and we said enough. Let's create our own system. We came up with the name, the Expedited Resource Response Plan. We came up with a cool name. Basically what it is, you pick up the phone, chief, and you tell me you've got a fire that's not threatening, but actually burning structures. I'll dump 50 engines to LA. Tell me where you want them. We're not even going into the system. You want them at Elm and Main, they're on the way. And I can have them on the road in 10 minutes. Good bet for me because those guys have more resources and I can get them. So literally it's a phone call. And then working with the state, the Office of Emergency Services, all they're asking for is, hey, send us an email saying you were contacted, and that's enough for the legislative reimbursement process to cover us. At that point, I'm not even concerned about reimbursement. We've got people, homes being burned. We've exercised that now on several occasions, and it drives the Forest Service and CAL FIRE absolutely nuts. You can't do that. That's bullshit. We can do that. We can exchange resources among fire departments under master mutual aid all we want. And we found that we have to. How do you stand up to the public and say, look, I could have sent them, I feel terrible because we could have sent them more if we'd known there were more earlier, as could others. I've had them send me between the 3 agencies 50 engines when I needed them. They're an hour and a half away. We've done the same thing. And so we have our own mutual aid agreement, if you will. And worse is if I send 20 engines up to LA today, we've told them ask for another 20 engines because we may need them back. And so, you're going to need another 20. So that's where those other 20 or 30 or 50 engines, they could come from other parts of the state and have time to get there. We'll loan you our stuff until they get there. Then we need to pull it back. And so we've created this thing, and I'm telling you, the Forest Service is just, they hate us because of it, but it works.
Yeah.
But isn't that ridiculous? It's a phone call. We're back to phone calls.
They hate you because it works. That's why.
It works. Oh,
so one other thing that I want to get into, I'll go to you, David, is I was under the impression, and I think most of our viewers probably are, at least from the middle of the country and the East Coast, is that if you wanted a fixed plane, a large plane that's going to drop, that you would just order it like you would order a fire engine. And your book talks about that innovation is completely stifled, and essentially all of these planes are retrofitted. Can you speak to that? Because I think America doesn't even understand that. They think that these tankers are, the Forest Service needs another 20 tankers. They just go out and buy it. And now we know how many they have, which is just absurd. Go ahead.
Yeah, so 15 tankers are contracted nationwide to cover 3.8 million square miles, excuse me. That number itself should concern everyone. 15 is not enough. The types of aircraft used are old version commercial passenger planes for the most part. They're not really freighters. They're They're passenger planes. They can hold 2,000 to 4,000 gallons on the medium-sized tankers. A large tanker, being a DC-10, can hold 8,000 gallons. The 747 that used to be contracted had 19,200 gallons of opportunity for retardant. That contract is terminated. They're not using that plane any longer. So we have a retrofitted fleet of older planes run by vendors, contractors, operators who know how to operate the planes pretty well and are available under contract to provide those services generally 6 months to 8 months during the year on an emergency use basis or essential use basis. And then there's another, call it 15 or so planes available on a call when needed basis that are also out there as a potential, but have to go through some hoops to get them in place. But the call takes place from the incident commander to bring those planes into the fire, and that can take anywhere from 1 to 3 days after the fire starts. And that's our concern, is that we have smaller planes called seats or single engine air attack aircraft. We have helicopters, both of which are very effective tools that could be put in the air immediately. When the bell rings in the firehouse that says there's a fire in Malibu, the planes are in flight the same day and taking out the fire, because we want to put the fire out first. We want to get everything we can put on that fire as soon as possible. And in our opinion, by doing so, then you really are getting ahead of the curve and solving the problem. But that's not our attitude. Our attitude is 1 to 3 days after the fire takes place, the call will go out to put an aircraft on the fire itself. And that's too long.
It's clear that we need financing for this from the federal government. The money that they're allocating clearly isn't enough, but we just can't throw good money into a bad system. They also need to adjust the policies so that the taxpayers' money will be used efficiently. We're at the witching hour. We're going to go around the horn. We're also going to post a link with this show. Running out of time, I recommend that everybody gets this book and get this book, read this book, and then drop it off at your congressman or senator's office and say, I just read this book and I need you to take a look at this, because we're all breathing wildland smoke. Another thing, just with the finances, I want to talk about real quick. I want to ask if somebody, like a 5-second question. If somebody's house burns down in a fire and FEMA and OSHA, FEMA comes in and everybody comes in, the government doesn't just give them money. They give them a loan to rebuild the house, correct? Okay. Yes. So here we give all this foreign aid, but yet we just give it. We don't charge interest. We don't give favorable terms and say at the conclusion of major operations, all this federal aid going out throughout the world needs to be paid back. That alone would allow us to get the aircraft and everything else and not cost the taxpayers an extra dime, and we would still be helping out our allies. But we give federal aid to people that hate us as well, that we say that we're giving them money for free so that we can buy control and influence. And right now we see that the world is on fire, literally, from California to Israel to everywhere else. We need to do a better job with the taxpayers' money. I'm going to go around the horn, let everybody have their last word. That's it for Politics and Tactics today. What a great panel. We also are going to have you back in the future because there's more on the policy end that I'd like to talk about. I'll start with PJ. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Frank, thanks for the opportunity. As always, this is an interesting conversation, not something that I'm well-versed in. So it's great to hear from this panel, to hear some of the challenges our brothers and sisters are experiencing in an area that it's not all that far, but someday conversations like this make it seem real far from Connecticut. So thank you, everybody.
Jeff?
2 comments. One, put out the fire. Everything else emanates from that. And second, we have to recognize that there's a public health issue with all of the smoke and the particulate matter in the air. It is a big, big problem, and people aren't even aware of it. And I'll just stop at that. It's an enormous problem. Toxicology, pharmacology, everything else involved with it.
And this isn't a West Coast problem anymore. It's an American problem because, like I said, there was days we had trouble breathing in Connecticut. So it's everywhere. Chief, last words?
Yeah, and you know what? I'll piggyback on what Jeff shared. You know, I happened to be back in Columbus, Ohio at a Metro Chiefs conference when the first smoke from the Canadian fires moved into New York and then ultimately the capital. And I was with the U.S. Fire Administrator, Dr. Lori Moore Merrill, very good friend, close friend. And, you know, she pulled me into a quick meeting with the FEMA administrator because the White House had lost their minds because the smoke had now affected. It became a big deal for them when the smoke impacted the Capitol and wanted to know what we could do. I was on this call with the FEMA administrator and the fire administrator saying, what can we do to help Canada? And me and the LA County chief who were in the trailer, the command trailer, said, well, I'm willing to send aircraft, hand crews, whatever it takes up there, but there's no mechanism to be able to do that. And they all about fell over. They said, what do you mean? We can't just, no, you know, between the State Department. So bureaucracy is not only hampering our ability for you folks in Connecticut and others to come out and help us in the West, but to help others in our neighboring countries. So, and I'll end with this. You can throw as much money as you want at the problem. What I'm hoping will happen is all this money's now been appropriated and sent. I'd like to know how much actually got used, because I bet it's very little that could be used for suppression needs or other areas. That's it. Thank you for having me.
David, last word?
Funding is a big issue. Jeff's hit the nail on the head. It's put out the fire first, and let's deal with the smoke. What is going to drive, I think, the conversation are two things. One, in California, homeowners are no longer able to buy fire insurance in fire risk areas, high fire risk areas. So you buy a home and you can't get fire insurance? I'm calling my congressman, right? Why not? Second, yesterday, the power in our house was out for 2.5 hours, shut down by Southern California Edison because of, as the chief said, we're in Santa Ana wind conditions. So I can't enjoy my home, my property, because I'm shut down with electricity for 2.5 hours. Maybe that's 3 hours or 4 hours next time. People are not going to put up with those two significant issues in their lifestyle. We have to change priorities in the country in terms of funding. And if we don't change the funding priorities to deal with quality of life in the country, wildfires being one of those issues, I think we have lots of more serious problems ahead of us.
Very well said. And that's it for Politics and Tactics today. Look forward to seeing everybody at FDIC in April. Make sure you book a room. They're booking up quick. And again, check out the book, Running Out of Time, and we'll make sure that we put the link on the website. Mark, take us off.